Today on the Dig In podcast, I'm joined by Professor Juliana Claassens, a scholar of the Old Testament and human dignity at Stellenbosch University. She's the author of Mourner, Mother, Midwife, a powerful work that reimagines God's liberating presence through feminine metaphors. In this conversation, we explore the deep roots of these images in Scripture and how they challenge patriarchal frameworks while revealing the compassion and strength of God in a whole new light. Let's dig in. Welcome back, everybody, to the Dig In podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Johnny Ova, and today we have Dr. Juliana Claassens with us. And man, do we have a topic to discuss today, huh, Dr. Claassens?
Yes, wonderful to be with you today. Yeah, talking about the topic I love, a book that was so foundational in my own scholarly journey. So,
yeah, really excited. Right before we went live, I told Dr. Claassens that I YouTube stalked her and watched every video that she had put up, and just seeing her on the news and on different shows and just being highlighted by the Academy of just all the stuff and all the work, the books, and really fighting for the cause of equality and gender equality. So I'm really interested in diving into this deeper with you today. So I guess let's learn a little bit about you. I always ask our guests, our audience knows where you're coming from. Tell us a little bit about maybe your upbringing. Were you born and raised in a Christian home? Is faith something that you kind of, adapted later on in life? Are you closer to God now, further away from God? Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
yeah, so I grew up in South Africa, in Pretoria, and in a Christian household. I learned a lot about God from my mother. So she's a very strong figure in my religious upbringing. I always went to church and somehow fell in love also with the Bible and proclaiming, preaching on the Bible. I was one of the first women to go study theology in our denomination. So it's only opened up in 1990. So I was in 1991, the first year at the University of Stellenbosch. So didn't really have role models as female pastors. Only had a female teacher when I went to Princeton, so Princeton Theological Seminary. I had Catherine Sarkenfeld. So it's interesting, sort of my journey. As this book and some of my other work is very much thinking about God in a very personal way, but also worrying about some of the misuse, the abuse of God language, and trying to find other ways of speaking about God. In terms of, I still would say, for me, I feel very close to God. I mean, God's a very real presence in my life. But I mean, it's also, as I've tried to argue also in this book, many years ago, came out in 2012. But I mean, that it's sort of that one is a bigger image of God. That I think often our constructions of God is so narrow. But my work and some of the work through others have done of trying to, show a bigger God, so which is very much committed to sort of justice and love and sort of calling us to follow suit.
Sure. I got to say, too, this has come at the perfect time because I'm literally starting a series on Sunday called What Does the Bible Say About That? And we're talking about this verse where Paul tells the women to be silent in the back of the church. And kind of opening that, because I'm one for, just so you understand my framework and where I'm coming from. I guess this would help our conversation. I have women, elders and deacons and leaders in our church. We just had a young lady minister for the first time on Sunday. I get killed and crucified by a lot of the surrounding churches and it's still crazy to me that we're in 2025 and we have all this knowledge and understanding of history, and we still can't even understand the simple verses of, no male nor female, no slave nor master. No, like Jesus came to level the playing field and to give everybody, and God uses everybody differently, but everybody equally, and everybody's equal in value and should be treated, protected, and honored like that. And we could see so many women that God used throughout the scriptures and ordained them in ministry. And even after the canon was completed, all the amazing works that women have done. So I'm one to known to shake up the foundation a little bit over here. So I guess what inspired you to write the book of Mourner, Mother, Midwife? I guess there would be a good starting point.
Yeah, so that was actually my second project after I finished my PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary. So where I worked also on the image of God who provides, and did sort of show again, already showed there sort of a feminist interpretation of that, showing already in the rabbis and some of the early texts that they spoke about the God who provides in terms of nursing language, and also then in the biblical text. So that was already my start of my journey of reimagining God by doing it in conversation with scripture and the interpreters, and seeing the life-giving possibilities surrounding this metaphor. That became part my first book, The God Who Provides, so biblical images of divine nourishment. So after that, sort of, continued with this image of God, metaphors for God, a language for God, but turning to the metaphor of God as liberator, which so often is connected also with the image of God as warrior, and sort of this very powerful male image that's with God with blood on his hands, which I again now working on in Nahum. So I'm circling around some of these topics, so it's interesting to think about that. But yeah, so, and again, wanting to this very foundational image of a God as a liberator, which we see also all the way in the New Testament, in sort of the image also of Jesus on the cross. But sort of trying to understand, but is it only, is there other ways of also speaking about God as liberator? And then sort of finding, again, these minor voices in the text, but so important, sort of God as sort of a mourner or a wailing woman in the book of Jeremiah. Seeing in Deutero Isaiah sort of a number of texts that speak about God as a mother, a woman in labor, but then also as a nurturing, caring, sort of nursing mother. And then seeing this image of God as midwife in the Psalms, sort of which are all three images connected then also with liberation, life-giving, nurturing, sustaining, and helping us to strong images, but also what it does sort of then recoding or challenging sort of a very typical narrow male construction of violence that, that leads to death. So these texts sort of really want to say, sort of what can be life-giving.
Sure. It seems like that this has created a passion. And, I obviously being from Long Island, I don't know much about the South African community and culture, but I would have to believe that something, not just culturally, but in the church, really burned a passion inside of you, seeing women, I guess specifically, being oppressed by God in the name of God, but not really in the name of God, by so, can you speak on that a little bit? Maybe what you've witnessed in regards to that.
Yeah, and I mean, sort of growing up, I mean, it's like my colleague always say, you only know what you know, or you see what you can see. And I mean, it was only also later I returned back home to teach after teaching for 8 years in the United States in different contexts. And so I've been teaching now for 15 years back home at University of
Nice.
Stellenbosch. But the sort of seeing also, in terms of poverty, in terms of gender-based violence, South Africa is sort of the rape capital of the world, and trying to understand why is that, and why is that women are still excluded in so many ways. And so that have been sort of trying to influence my work, and also thinking of how I teach and how I write, and then also thinking, what are our construction, the images of God, what role that plays. The old saying, Mary Daly was one of the first feminist scholars. She always used to say, if God is male, male becomes God. And again, trying to find alternative ways of speaking about God, but also empowering women and men, sort of in a way to say that it can be different, it should be different, let every voice count, let every person count as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more there. I see the imagery of, and it is challenging to traditional constructs, and I guess unfortunately it takes time, because when you're taught something for so long, to grab somebody who's 40, 50, 60 and come at them with something different, it's their brain almost, you can almost see it like colliding with each other. But like when I look at it, I see that God, in the beginning, you see almost this aspect of the story of him creating Adam, and he pulls from Adam and he separates. I feel like more than this is not just let me create a separate brain. He separates Eve from Adam, and now they're both equal aspects of the reflection of God. And when the unity comes, I feel like it holds God out some more. And you do see, and this is going to be my next question of why do you think feminine imagery for God has been overlooked or suppressed in traditional theology just as a whole, and why some of these verses are just taken out and used as hammers instead of his arms extended in love?
Yeah, and I think again, I think because a lot of the biblical texts, most of the biblical texts have been written by men for men, and most of the biblical interpreters over the last 2,000 years plus have been also male. Again, it's sort of looking at the text at a particular way and seeing it in a particular worldview also as well. So it is when sort of female sort of interpreters also join the guild, when you have more, like Elizabeth Johnson saying that women interpreters gave us new eyes for reading the scriptures and for thinking about the theological doctrines and looking at the practices and what our church communities look like. And it's sort of to say also that we reset it in a different way, to say that we create communities that welcomes everyone equally. And I mean, in that regard, our biblical interpretation looks different. Our sermons look different. Our prayers look different. So it's something that can change on so many different levels, which is not, sort of taking away from what it was, but it's sort of enriching, broadening, expanding, the circle.
Yeah, I always make this statement: our diversities unified makes us more powerful.
Yeah.
When we just hang and chill and talk and fellowship with people who look like us, talk like us, think like us, we really do neglect the whole image of God. Because God, one of my friends, he always says, and he says it sarcastically and jokingly, but he says, always notice that God is always for what you're for and always against what you're against. And we create this God in our own image and then project that, especially in leadership, if you're projecting it on the congregation. And this is how this stuff multiplies, in my opinion, very quickly. Getting these different perspectives, I think, are really important. So these metaphors like mother, midwife, mourner, as mentioned in your book, how do they expand our understanding of the divine as a whole? What are some things that you've uncovered that you could share with us, that like maybe some things that just blew your mind in some of these studies around these topics?
Yeah, and it's so interesting how one thing leads to another. And actually, I was rereading, Mourner, Midwife yesterday, again, and it was, just to see some of how it's sort of really paradigmatic and sort of emblematic from the work I've been continuing to do over these past 12 years. I can't believe it, 12, 13 years. And something, I mean, so for instance, I mean, I've done quite a bit of work since on trauma hermeneutics, and the text and reading that as a lens. And so actually this text of God as the weeping God, and then the wailing woman, which is like this just throwaway line in Jeremiah, which opens up this whole world of reading even the book of Jeremiah and the prophets, as against the context of incredible hardships and how trauma hermeneutics help us to see, the importance of putting our pain and suffering into words. And often, the trauma response is that we are numb and confused. We don't have words. We don't know what to say. And how the wailing woman, the wise woman in this book of Jeremiah teaches their neighbors and teaches their daughters how to mourn. And then interesting to see, but how it's God who calls the wailing woman. So actually God then being the first mourner, the one who is weeping about what's happening in the world. Now, even just that is, you can have a whole series on that. I mean, about
Sure.
God who weeps about what's happening around us, and who should weep. And I mean, and it calls on people to weep as well. And I unpack that in sort of the chapter on God as mourner. But I mean, even just the wailing woman, the mourners as the prophets, as the one who's saying what's happening here is wrong, and then to say, but, sort of God is saying it's wrong. So it's like even some of things of that, of exploring, bringing community together, act sort of resistance, sort of work I've done also later on as well. So, yeah, so that was a very strong image as well. Interesting on the mothering side, it was so interesting when I looked at this in the acknowledgements. So, I mean, it's the last book where I would not mention my daughter, Suzanne. So she was born in 2012. So for a very long time, I wanted to be a mother. It was complicated. I worked in America. My husband lived in South Africa. Took a while. But I got, I was basically pregnant probably just after I finished the page, the manuscript and that. So she was born also in the year that this book
Wow.
was published. It was interesting. I remember being on maternity leave, and after this book, I continued writing on the metaphor of God as a woman, on the metaphor of God as a woman in labor. But that also how that in Jeremiah is used also in the context of trauma, but then also some of the other prophets as an image of restoration that you also see in Deuteronomy. So that was kind of interesting again. I mean, a lot of my writing feels very existential and embodied. And you don't always say that in the books, but if you read between the lines and below the
Sure.
surface, you'll see a lot of me in the book. So
The
yeah, so
fact
that
that you were
was
pregnant while writing that book is incredible to know.
yeah, finishing that book. Yeah, so isn't that, yeah. So, and it's something in there. I mean, it's even the laboring process. I think I write about that in acknowledgements. I mean, writing a book, and this book was a difficult book even to get written and published and took time and moved over continents and moved back home. But it's, yeah, it's very generative and it's laborious, but it's in the end, it's lovely. And now my daughter is 13.
It
As a
goes
small
fast.
morning mother midwife. So, yeah.
Yeah, it goes fast. I have a 13-year-old too. My wife gave birth to our son in May of 2011. So
Okay.
he turned 13, and yeah, it goes fast. You blink and it's gone. But man, the fact that how much you could relate while being pregnant, going through these pains while you're in this book is, I guess, that makes that book come more to life to you. It means more to you.
Yeah.
You're through it. That's great. Let me transition is how did the ancient audiences understand these metaphors? How would you say, like, if we took us back to the I guess the recipients of the writings of these people, how would they have received it?
Sorry, I missed that. So just say again, the writings of the people, sort of, it cut out there a bit.
Yeah, no problem. I said, how did the ancient audiences understand these metaphors in their own cultural context?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So some of it is like, yeah, so I mean, part of it is there's something very universal, to the human experience, also of childbearing, or that, even giving birth in that context would have been really a battle between on life and death. I mean, a lot of women died in childbirth. So even the warrior language, I mean, it's battle imagery, sort of that. So some of that, but so there's something universal about the experience of giving birth and that, but there's also something very culturally specific, and which would, so of course, in terms of doing biblical scholarship, one trying to honor that. Also, it's not written in our time; it's written in a different time. Some of this would have been quite subversive, I would say. I mean, even finding sort of all these in Deuteronomy, Isaiah, suddenly you find all these female imagery also for God. And some people have made some suggestions why that is. It's also tried to counter, maybe some other goddesses that sort of emerge in that time. So, but God is also female in terms of that. Is it also in terms of the trauma, sort of almost that nurturing in the context of, sort of mothers and children, sort of being most precarious. I mean, to say, but, even mothers might forget or turn away from their children. Like we see in the book of Lamentations, direct response to what we see, the horrors that's described in Lamentations, but God will not. God will restore, God will protect. So, again, these biblical conversations going on, which is quite interesting as well.
Yeah. How do you think these female or feminine images intersect with the themes of justice, compassion, and liberation? Like you have mentioned that before, like how they parallel a lot.
Yeah.
So how do they intersect?
Yeah, and I think, for you asked also what was interesting, some of the text. I mean, sort of like the midwife text, and really in Psalms. I was really sort of, I think, one of the first people writing on it or noticing it. And I'm not a Psalm scholar, but it was just so interesting to see that and to see how it's an image of liberation, but then also to bring in conversation with what we know about the midwives in the book of Exodus, which is just such a powerful image of resistance. These two, whether they Egyptian or Hebrew midwives, I mean, it's ambiguous. Could be that they are Hebrew midwives ministering or working for Hebrew women, but it could also be that they're Egyptian midwives working for the Hebrew women, which is both very interesting to explore. But I mean, how they go against the Pharaoh, how they refuse to let these babies die, how they almost trick and lie, in order just to save these Hebrew babies. Yeah, so I think that is so again interesting in terms of a question of justice, of being. And I used somewhere a poem by so Rabbi Arthur Wasco, which is also this liturgy, or is sort of an alternative seder, and which is sort of speaking about the idea of God as midwife, but also then of human midwives, of following suit, sort of helping. There's things we can do to bring life in situations of death, and even sometimes to resist where there is life-denying circumstances. So yeah, so I think there is quite a bit of scope in seeing this feminine imagery, but also see that how it relates to questions of justice.
Yeah, beautiful revelation. Real beautiful. The prophetic literature I've also noticed too has a lot of the birth imagery in there, right? The beginning of birth pangs we read about, birthing new things, old seasons dying, new things coming to creation. So, what role do you feel that, like, how would you tie those together? Even with lament, what role does lament and birth imagery have in the prophetic literature? And why do you think that God, or the biblical writers, I should say, would even use that type
Yeah.
of language?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's such a profound part of human experience. I mean, we all are born, sort of, that's how we come into the world, but it's laborious, it's painful, it's without, any, epidurals, so and, sort of modern medicine that, so there's something in there that realizing the pain that comes. It's also used in some of the prophetic literature to speak about the soldiers, the enemy soldiers, but also Israelite soldiers who feel that they feel paralyzed, like a woman in labor. I mean, if you are in labor, which is sometimes you can be hours, can be days. It's not that you can run a marathon or do your work or whatever. Sort of, you are sort of really unable to fight or unable to go on. So, but then there's also an end to it. So it's also this the bearers of new life, the beginnings, and maybe even the point of connection in metaphor. If you're in the midst of the struggle, if you're in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the trauma, it feels like it's labor without end.
Mm,
But in most of the, or many of the circumstances or situations, there is a baby that's being born. There is the promise of new life that comes. And that hope is then also where, I mean, even also associating that with God, but also very much coming out of a situation of deep distress in which people were during most of the prophetic literature was written.
right. Right. So you also wrote a book, Claiming Her Dignity, right? I got the name of that right. Claiming Her Dignity.
Yes.
And I was reading some excerpts on the book, and you explore this topic of female resistance in the Old Testament a bit, at least from what I've saw. So how does that connect to your work? I guess just talk about the topic a little bit of female resistance specifically in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and I mean, this is also interesting how one thing leads to another. I mean, so this project came to work. I started in my PhD and then continued. And then actually this image of midwives, Shiframpua, that I reference here, I mean, such a strong image of resistance. And then in my sort of continuing some of my other work also looked at the image of laughter and tears as means of resistance. I have an essay also on Sarah and Hagar, which is, also very emblematic for some of the work I've done. And it relates also this thing about, in a context of oppression or context, where the empire is very strong, how do people survive? How do they not give up? And, so James Scott has talked about this notion of hidden transcripts, and you see this very much in the African American community as well, the stories they tell. So, Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox. I mean, that's children's stories, but it's actually very important stories to say that, those who are seemingly weak or subjugated can outwit, outsmart, outlast, that the empire won't last forever. That there's something in there that, you must be smart, you should stay alive, to fight another day, but you can tell jokes. Often jokes about the enemy. Sigmund Freud already talked about that. I mean, telling jokes is a way of survival, and South Africans are very good about that. Sometimes a bit dark humor, but I mean, telling jokes is a way to sustain oneself and then also in terms of lament, we talked about lament as resistance. Claiming her dignity brought together some of this idea, what we talked about, women in my context, but also globally, are very vulnerable in context of war, in context of poverty, in context of ongoing patriarchy, what I call their heterarchy, which is the idea, which is not just gender, but also race and class that makes people vulnerable, especially women and children, very vulnerable. Yeah, and then also in terms of violence and how these biblical stories of women resisting that violence, even Tamar resisting the violence of rape, in terms of resisting the violence of war, Rizpah, lament, weeping about her children, and how that becomes such strong images, very small images. Rizpah do not speak. Many of these female figures we do not hear their voices, but they are there. And, so we can see the examples of not giving up, of continuing to, and which continued also in some of my other work on writing and reading to survive, how biblical stories, but also contemporary novels show examples of, female protagonists who do not give up, who continue to find ways of staying alive, but also not just staying alive, surviving, but also in the end, also to be able to thrive.
I'm sure this work for you has been extremely rewarding and seeing the fruit of all the labor that you've put into this. And so I guess, how does reframing these stories and talking about these stories empower readers, especially women today? What are some of the things that you've seen?
Yeah, and I mean, I see this very much, for my students. I mean, even reading Mourner, the Midwife. I teach a lot of this, also my classes. So I've been teaching now 15 years in Stellenbosch, and before that I taught a number of different places in the United States. So, I mean, it's really rewarding to see for students who love this and who this is also life changing and, continue to do work of their own in this or in congregations and so that's rewarding. And it was actually interesting, even reading when I bought. We are currently on sabbatical in Germany, so I don't have my copy of Mourner Mother Midwife with me, but I bought it on Kindle, and it just seeing the reviews on Amazon, and it was just like so personal for me that there's actually people reading it. I mean, even with you, picking this up and wanting to talk about this after all these years. I mean, it's really lovely to see that, I mean, words that I've written so long ago makes a difference in people's lives. And it's often, it's people, it's pastors, it's people, not just in biblical studies, but also in pastoral care or systematic theology, who say, you're bringing a different way of looking at these texts that's helpful. So that's very rewarding, makes it all worthwhile.
Well, I got to honor you, Dr. Claassens, because you are so. Like I mentioned, we've been really ramping this up. We've been doing like 2 a week for the last probably a month and a half, 2 months now, as we're plowing through a lot of these. And you are the first woman that we've had on the Dig In podcast. 3 months.
Goodness.
So you are
Hopefully
the
not the last.
no, definitely not. We already got some more booked, but you are the we're gonna just dub you the queen of the digging podcast temporarily.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll take that.
But it is a lot of this stuff reminds me of, again, some of the oppressive conversation that we've had today, and a lot of the injustice stuff is the mindsets of people. And I always think about how to break this. And even going this last question, like, how does it impact women? I really feel like the men need to get a revelation of this too, because from my perspective anyway, it seems like the men are the oppressive ones with this topic. The women aren't oppressing women with this topic for the most part, from what I see. But it's a lot of the men. I remember walking into a church on Long Island over here. Man, this is probably 12 years ago, probably around 2012, 2013. And I'm walking in, I'm holding my wife's hand. And when I walked in, the usher actually separated me and my wife's hands. I thought he was going for a handshake, and made my wife sit in the corner on one side of the room and took me up on the stage where there was a throne. And so I was like, my goodness, and it wasn't so the head pastor had a big throne, and there was like five smaller ones, and me and like four of the guys are on there. I was just invited by a friend to come check out this service. So I'm sitting up here listening to what they're talking about. I'm looking at my wife in the corner going, what on earth is happening right now? Like, what are we a part of? And they were doing some really other funky stuff that was really, really ridiculous, where I just got up and walked off the stage and ended up leaving because they tried to lock the doors. Like, it was just a really awkward thing, but you see just in that, it's like, wow, how does I'm fearful for their marriages. Like, and it's one thing that me and my wife, when we talk about some of our goals and visions about the church, one of the things that's at the top of the line for me and her is we want to show them what a healthy marriage looks like. A woman, my wife, flourishing in her gifts, like legitimately joyful and excited to co-labor with me, to partner with us and lead by example there. And when people comment on our marriage, or they comment of even how happy and full of joy she looks, that makes me happy. And it's one of the things that I think the men need to grab a revelation on. So I'm sure you face many challenges over the years in your works.
Yes, but I can say also I'm married to a very good man who's also my colleague. So I think we
That's good.
also try to model that, and so we're really partners, and sort of, yeah. So that is wonderful. I think I do. Just to say, I mean, men need a revelation. There's a lot we need to talk about, and maybe you can get me on for another time talking about fragile masculinities and
Sure,
just
that'd
in
be
hyper masculinity and how, I mean, so there's a lot of work done on there to say, I mean, people, yeah, they are trained, they are sort of enculturated in a certain system, but a lot of men are also really wounded, and that becomes part of how they act in some ways. But women are also part of the system. And so I think it's all of us need to be liberated, sort of in terms of that. And, I do a lot of the work. I often would say I do this also for my daughter. She's a strong, independent woman, that she can be safe, that she can be who she is, and I think that is, and I think we need to start our work, especially with the young people, for young girls, that they realize also their self-worth, that they have gifts, for young boys, how do you treat women, so there's a lot of work to be done, that already starts, at a very young age. It's a multi-pronged approach. We need to, preach this,
good. Yeah,
teach this, do it on many levels. But yeah, I do think we need to really spend time also with the youth.
yeah, and having platforms, I guess, for open conversations about this too, because
Yes.
some of the things that I've learned, just even increasing in empathy over the last decade or so,
Yeah.
and just because you're so caught up in like, oh, this is the way it is because this is the way I've been brought up and this is all I know. And then when you really try to make the effort to sit in somebody else's shoes, and even from and honestly, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's something that where I run with many different circles, and some of the circles that I run in, they're very, I don't want to say anti this. They are open. I don't want to paint them as complete like jerks or anything like that, because they're definitely not. but really challenging the part of empathy in regards to all people of all sections, whether it was, one of the things at the church, the Black Lives Matters movement that was going on, to the COVID stuff and all of the stuff. And one of the points I just kept bringing up was if my wife felt neglected by me, even if I 100% thought it was not true, and let's just pretend that it wasn't true, but the fact that she feels that way deserves my full attention and my ear to figure out what am I giving off in that way. And I think just because people are like, oh no, you're not neglected. I do this, I do this, I did, but it's taking that time to really sit down and understand like why. And so one of the things with the Black Lives Matter movement and COVID all happening at the same time at our church, one of the most beautiful moments that I felt that took place was my church that we oversee is very diverse. We were a grassroots church. We planted the church. We grew from our 5 people up into now over 100. We get 30,000 people that watch us every month. So this interview goes right on the homepage of that. So we got a pretty cool large audience when it comes to that. And I remember we were still really pushing the button of staying open when everybody else was closing. But I remember one of the last times we took like a month off and then we were able to reopen again. But during one of those last times we gathered, I remember walking out and seeing our Black congregation members, our white congregation members, the older, the widowed, the young. Our church has Democrats in it, Republicans in it, conservatives in it, libertarian. Like we have legitimately like every aspect and background represented. And I remember leaving and they were still in the church. They formed a circle with chairs and they were just communicating. And I just put my bag down. I sat in a media section just watching what they were doing. And they sat and just spoke for almost 2 hours that day. And to me, that was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen. The fact that it was such a respectful and honest and open dialogue. And I feel like that moment really forged a bond in our church where we were really kind of helping each other out. And I was like, man, why can't the church just do stuff like this? Like, why can't we just sit there and have these conversations like this and be more empathetic on there? And again, our conversations, it just stirs those feelings and emotions in me. And I just think it's such a needed thing to do to really move past some of the limitations that we put on as the church body.
Amen.
Awesome. So you mentioned that, as we're wrapping up here, you mentioned that you've done a lot of other works over the last 12 years, saying, because I know we're talking about a bit of an older book. Tell our audience what have you been working on? What do you got coming up in the future, if anything? Are you traveling anywhere? Can people connect with you on social media anywhere? Share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so yes, so since Mourner Mother Midwife, so I wrote Claiming Her Dignity in 2016, and then in 2020 I also referred to this. I wrote a monograph on biblical and contemporary trauma narratives, which brings together my love also for Bible and literature, so novels, as a great excuse to read as well, and to see some of the interesting conversations between Bible and literature that can be created. So that's Writing and Reading to Survive, which is also very existential. And then I worked on a commentary on Jonah, which is a lot of fun. So for the Old Testament Library series. So that just came out last year, 2024.
Very cool.
It's
I'm gonna find all this and link this in the descriptions in the YouTube channel.
And I love that. I mean, that was such a fun project to work on. I really enjoyed it. Now I'm writing on Nahum, so also a commentary. But I mean, continuing some of these questions on God language, on metaphor, on trauma, of embodiment, of lament. So it's really interesting. So I'm working on that now. I'm on sabbatical. We get sabbaticals, which is wonderful every couple of years. So we're in Germany right now in Marburg, but we're actually coming to the United States in the fall. So I'll be in Atlanta.
In Atlanta, okay.
Yeah, so I'll be teaching my husband as well. We'll teach a class at Columbia Theological Seminary, and also then writing. So writing and teaching, and then we go back home in December.
Okay.
And I'm on Instagram, but I'm more posting nice photos of traveling and I'm not an activist on social media. So
Dr. Claassens is on the gram, so that's good. Do you have an email maybe that somebody could get, or a website that if people have questions they can shoot you?
Yeah, I mean, so people can look at on the academia side some of my writings there, but also J. Claassens at Sun, where you reach me at .ac.za.
Perfect. Awesome. All right, my last question today, and then I'll let you go. How might this vision of God as mourner, mother, midwife shape our faith and justice work today? Like, project this.
Absolutely. And again, rereading this, I mean, I feel this book is really sort of timeless and very important now in terms of what we talked about, the mourning, a God who mourns and laments about the wars in the world, sort of injustice, gender-based violence, all the things we can add to that. A God who nurtures, sustains, gives new life, where people feel, I mean, I've been thinking a lot what's happening in Texas, sort of over the 4th of July. I mean, sort of that lot of hurt, sort of a new life coming out of, sort of death. I mean, it's really, really hard for those communities, but people do rebuild, people do go on. But I mean, sort of the idea of a God with them in that situation, but also bringing new life. And then, I mean, the idea of, midwife, again, saving, delivering, and calling us to also be midwives of justice.
Well, Professor Juliana Claassens, thank you so much for your time. This was fun. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and maybe we could do it again in the future on some of these other topics that you talked about, because I feel like we could go on for 3 more hours on some of the things that you opened up over here.
Yeah, but thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. So
thanks again.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to the Dig In podcast with me, Johnny Ova. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, and don't forget to rate us 5 stars on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. You can also check out more at soh.church. See you next time as we keep digging in.